wow, you know so many languages. How do you keep them all straight? I get that a lot in conversation, and I find myself always giving the same sort of answer to that. And so I thought I would just give the answer here, and maybe more people will find it useful. I think something underlies the question. The question assumes that the languages are going to be fighting with each other for the same spot in your brain, and that if you don't do something specific to keep them from all occupying that same spot, they're going to rush in and take over. And I think anyone who has studied more than one language, people are likely speaking from experience here. We've all felt that situation where you're trying to speak in Italian and Spanish comes out, or you're trying to speak in Spanish and English comes out, or whatever the thing happens to be. And so the more you have, the more you think, well, it just must be chaos all the time, as every language wants to come out all the time. Um, and so there's a couple of really, really simple things to say about this. The first is um, the greatest, the biggest reason why people have trouble keeping different languages straight in their minds is that they don't know one of the languages well enough. If you're just okay at Spanish, when you try to speak Spanish, other languages that you're more comfortable in are going to come to your mind instead. Essentially, confusing two languages usually is the result of insufficient time spent in one or both of the languages in question. When I first started learning Italian, I kept wanting to use Spanish words. But the better I got in Italian, the less that happened until my Italian got much better than my Spanish, and I found myself doing Spanish, which I also don't know that well, reaching for Italian words. Um, and that's been true over and over again. When I was learning French, when I was learning German, I would constantly, if I didn't know the word for something, I would just say it in French. And my German teacher was frustrated by it because he was like, "That's a really good strategy because a lot of times Germans will use French words to make things sound fancier. But I'll remind you that you're here to learn German, and so don't be lazy." Right. Um, so the first piece of advice then is simply this: make sure that when you study a language, you progress far enough in it to feel secure in it. Now, what does that mean? Can I quantify that in some way? It is hard to put an exact number on it, especially because whether you're learning a language in a classroom over the course of a college semester, or you're learning it on your own, or you're doing an evening class, all those have different lengths of time associated with them. But essentially, you want to learn a language until you reach the point where you are reading literature in that language. It doesn't have to be the hardest literature in that language by any means, but just where you can start picking up, novels in that language. Maybe say you're studying French. Maybe you're not reading Marcel Proust, but maybe you just pick up a contemporary French novel and read that. Right, or something that's easy in that language that you're reading it, and you're spending the time learning and just enjoying the language in its own right. Right. As long as you're in the classroom, working out of a textbook, doing exercises, you're constantly trying to translate French into English. You want to get to the place where you're just reading in French and it doesn't have any clear connection to English. You're just enjoying the language on its own. So you've got to get to the place where you can get that going enough. And then you've got to do that for a while. You've got to get some reps, some time in the language under your belt, because what you're doing is you're building neural pathways for that language. The stronger your neural pathways are in a language, the less likely they're going to be invaded by other languages, right? The neural pathways, when they get well defined, then they tend to stay separate from one another. It's when they're fuzzy that they can start to come together and overlap. That's the biggest thing. Don't quit too soon. Make sure you really stick with it. If you've put in 200 hours to get to the point where you're okay at a language, put in 50 more to get to the place where you're solid at it. Right? It's too soon to stop, and why waste the time you put in already by not going a little bit further and getting it locked in? That probably means you're doing some reading on your own. Maybe you get a reading group together, get other people like you, and you guys get together and read together and help one another out. Maybe you have, a native speaker over to your house once a month to talk with you, that sort of a thing. But you got to keep it going. And then the other thing I would say about this is on the other side of it. So let's say you've done that work and now you've gone away into your life, and in your daily life, you're not using, we'll keep talking about French, you're not using French very often. You don't see it very, very often. What do you do now? Suddenly you're finally planning that trip to France and you got to make sure you're ready to go. What does that look like? If you've done good work on the front end, the work on the back end is a lot less because neural pathways that have been built up strong take a long time to decay. And in fact, if you build them up to a certain point, they don't decay completely. They just sort of reach a level of dormancy from which they can be reawakened very quickly. So when I was getting married, my wife and I were decided to honeymoon in Quebec City. And I expected them to speak predominantly French there, and I wanted to speak French with them. I had not been reading or speaking or listening to French for several years at that point, and so it was not very fresh in my mind. And I thought it's fine. I've got a few months before we go. I'll read a French novel, and then by the time we go, I should be in good shape. So I had picked up a Jules Verne novel. I think the first one was to this Journey to the Center of the Earth, and I started reading that in French. And the first night, in about an hour, I think I read about a page. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not gonna finish this book in the couple months before we go, but I'll just have to keep at it. And the second night, I think I read 2 pages in an hour. And the third night, I read something like 6 or 7 pages in an hour. And by the fourth night, I was reading 15 pages an hour. And I eventually got back up to my normal English reading speed. Not only did I finish that book, but I read 2 other books before we left. You see, in the space of less than a week, just that hour a day was reactivating the language, and things started coming back, and I got comfortable, and I was off and running. Um, so if you have deep neural pathways, you can reactivate things quickly. Um, the types of things that reactivate the neural pathways are the same types of things you needed to be doing after you were done learning the grammar to lock them in the first place, right? So again, that's reading books, listening to movies. It's really great to watch movies in the language if it's a modern language. Listen to it, turn the French language soundtrack on and put the French subtitles on so you can both see and hear it and have that connection still going until you don't need the subtitles anymore and you can turn the subtitles off. But if you never stop needing the subtitles, that's fine. Just keep it coming. Don't have the English subtitles there. Make yourself be okay with not understanding what's happening in the movie so long as you're spending time in the language. Or watch a movie you know very well in English, but in the French language with the French subtitles. Very, very helpful. Reading books in that language, as I said, speaking with people about it if you can get it. Listen to go on the internet and listen to the news, listen to radio stations, the bits of talking that come in between the music and the radio stations. It's very subtle. If you can have, say, for a lot of times I'll put on Radio Classique, which is the French classical music station, and while I'm working. And so I'll be listening to classical music, and then there'll be a break, and the announcer will come on and will speak in French and talk about the last piece and the piece that's coming up and get back on. And there's a normalcy to that trains my mind to accept this is just a normal thing. This is just something that goes on. And that's good for deepening those pathways so that they're easy to wake up again. So I suppose then what I'm saying is the way to keep languages straight is to learn them well. And once you have learned a language well, don't worry if you don't use it for a long time. It will come back to you quickly when you need it to. Give yourself some ramp up before you really need it, and don't fret about it and don't push too hard. Just understand that over the course of a week or so, it's going to reactivate very quickly and will be available to you again.